Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's just a few minutes after 1, so I think we will go ahead and get started. I am going to hand it over to Kimberly Kennison, the Executive Financial Officer here at OPM, just to start us off. So thank you again and welcome. Over to you, Kim.
Thank you, Julia. Appreciate it. I want to welcome everyone here today. Thank you for joining us for this RFP training today, and we really appreciate your time and your effort in our training sessions. I'd like to start today by introducing my talented procurement team and who will be walking you through this training today. First, Julia Fussfield, who introduced me. She's our Procurement Policy Development Coordinator. And the two other folks that are with us today we're very fortunate to have from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government Performance Lab, also known as GPL. And those two folks will be helping to present. It's Colin Earhart and Lars Benson. And they work closely with us at OPM, and we have all been working closely on our procurement reform. In addition, the fellows work with two other departments that are our partners, which is the Department of Administrative Services, as well as the Office of Early Childhood. We are pleased today to see that we have so many people attending this session today. So this is really great news to see that our training is being well received, and we will continue to offer procurement support to our partner agencies. And as you probably already know, that these trainings are a part of Secretary McCaw's procurement reform initiative, and RFP writing is a critical skill that will help advance the state's procurement goals. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Julia, and she will get our session started. And again, thank you for attending our trainings. Bye.
Thanks, Kim. So just a few quick notes about our presentation before we get started. On your screen on the top, you should see a Q&A chat function. So please feel free to submit questions and answers throughout the training as they come up. We will have a dedicated section at the end of the training to address questions and answers. And for anything we don't get to live today, we will publish a document with as many questions and answers as you all submit. So don't be shy, ask away. I'm also going to drop in the chat right now a link to a document that we'll be referencing later in the training. This document is an RFP template that we're going to be discussing throughout today's training. So I'm just pulling up that link right now so that I can add it in to the chat for you all. And so you're welcome to download this so that you can go through with us as we reference the document. We'll signal to you all when we are going to be using it. But if you're better at just listening to our presentation and then picking up on the template itself later, that's also totally fine. We'll be sharing all of these materials with you after the presentation. And finally, I did make this announcement just before Kim spoke, but I've posted a survey link in the chat as well. We would love for you to take this survey after the training to let us know how we did and what else we can train you on in the future. And so those of you who have been to our other training sessions are probably familiar with this, and we've really been trying to incorporate what you all have had to say. So that's, I think, should cover it on the logistics. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in. So today's training, as you all know, is on drafting results-driven requests for proposals, familiarly known as RFPs. So just by way of getting us started, a little bit about what we're going to cover in today's training. First, we're going to review what we mean when we talk about competitive procurement and why we think it's important, just some context setting. Then we're going to talk about what we've heard from you all and what my colleagues at the GPL have heard from their jurisdictions around the country about challenges that state and city staff around the country face when they're conducting competitive procurements. We'll talk a little bit about RFPs and why we think writing strong RFPs can help and make procurements better and more competitive. Then we'll introduce you to some tools that OPM and the GPL have developed to help support you all in writing RFPs. And finally, like I said, we will move to questions and answers. So to start, as Kim mentioned earlier, this training is part of a broader effort to address some procurement challenges in the state. So in August 2019, Secretary McCaw, the Secretary of OPM, announced heightened expectations for competitive procurements. And she charged us, this procurement team, with taking on some initiatives to help agencies undertake more competitive procurements. And we have, in response, developed a bunch of tools and initiatives to try to reach these goals. And you all might be familiar with some of our other training sessions we've had, but also our efforts to produce more data, be more transparent, work more closely with you all, and plan for procurements across the state. And a key element of competitive procurements, a key element to help competitive procurements go well and be successful, is RFP writing. So that's how we see today's training fit in with this procurement reform effort that you've probably heard from me before. So again, just as a refresher, and again, I think this will be familiar to folks who have joined other training sessions that we've held recently, we discussed that competitive procurement is a key priority for the state, but what do we mean when we talk about competitive procurement? And so competitive procurement is most basically defined as the process that we use in the state to look for the best value option to obtain the services we need. And we say best value, we mean both in terms of price, but also in terms of quality. And in order to find those best value solutions, we issue something called a solicitation. And a solicitation is our invitation for potential providers to respond and give us a sense of how they would approach providing a certain service. And specifically in the world of OPM procurement, which is PSAs and POSs, we are talking about requests for proposals. Requests for proposals are a type of solicitation document. And this training is all about how to do those well, and they're a key component to making competitive procurement happen. So we want to make sure that our RFPs are public, open, and fair, and that they result in responses that allow an agency to choose from a broad array of options for the best possible services to be provided. And this is the process we use to select a vendor. And so that's sort of to orient you in what we're talking about when we're talking about competitive procurement and where the RFP lives in that process. So before we jump into the meat of the training, we have a question for you all that we would love to hear your thoughts on in the chat. And so if you don't already have your chat box open, you'll see a show Q&A icon at the top right of your screen. It's a little bubble with a question mark, a little chat bubble with a question mark in it. And we would love for you to share some of your thoughts on competitive procurement and the challenges that you face when you're trying to do these. And we will sort of discuss those amongst us. So please don't be shy. We'll pause for a moment to let people share responses. But yes, please go ahead and post any thoughts in the chat. Don't be shy. Please share some of your experiences that have been challenging in doing competitive procurements and writing RFPs. We're seeing one agency partner has said that they are kind of alone in this and they don't have a lot of experience, and that's a big challenge they face. I don't know if Colin and Lars, if you all are seeing anything like that in your work.
Definitely, and I think we also just got another comment that timing is always a challenge, which I think definitely resonates. But definitely curious to hear others' thoughts as well about specific challenges that your agencies face.
One person is also, bringing up that they would really love to be working with more small business enterprises, and that it's challenging maybe to get responses from them in response to RFPs. Another person is telling us about how it's hard to know how to be specific enough in your RFP writing. That's a really big one that I think we all see and work with agencies to address.
It looks like we're seeing more comments about folks who are completely new to procurement and RFP writing having more understanding of the structures for first-time writers. That definitely resonates.
I'm seeing somebody say that a template would be wonderful. So bear with us for just a few minutes on that one. And
Stay tuned.
Surprised.
lack of experience and institutional knowledge, that's definitely a really good one. I think certainly balancing everything that is going on in the institution like the state is a huge challenge. Merging program detail with fiscal detail, that we hear a lot. That's a really good one.
Yeah, looks like we also have a comment about finding a qualified evaluation team, which I think we won't cover as much of that today, but definitely in future trainings, we're going to hope to help partner with agencies on best practices around evaluation procedures.
Convincing program staff that the program should go out to RFP, that's a really good one. And again, I think we've all been talking in all of our trainings a little bit about how to plan for RFP writing, and hopefully having a set of tools to make it a little bit easier could help convince those program folks about the benefits of this process.
I also see a really great one here about merging program details with fiscal details and how those are usually different people. I think that's a problem we see a lot. It's really hard to get individual departments or divisions in an agency to communicate and come out of their silos. And hopefully we can share some tips about that today too.
Great. These are all fantastic comments. And I know that Colin and Lars, who have worked, both here in the state and also with colleagues across the country, will have sort of a lot more to share and comment on with those. So thank you all for your inputs. We're going to hopefully address a bunch of these today. And I am going to turn it over to Colin to start us talking a little bit more specifically about these challenges and how we can address them. So Colin, over to you.
Thanks, Julia. So yeah, on the screen, you'll see we have a list of about 5 common agency challenges that Lars and I have definitely seen in working with agencies across Connecticut and in talking with our counterparts who are embedded in cities and states across the country. And many of these directly connect to what folks have already shared within the chat. So I'll kind of walk through a couple of these at a high level to help us all kind of understand that we're not alone. I think a lot of states and cities struggle with doing competitive procurements, and I think today's training is really about helping to sort of understand how we can mitigate against some of that. So the first challenge, which many folks have already brought up, is resource constraints. It takes a lot of time to actually do RFPs, to go through a full-blown competitive process, and agencies are balancing a lot of priorities. So it's one thing to say to an agency, go out and bid everything, but there's always conflicting things around time and urgency on what needs to get done. So it's always sort of a challenge to figure out how to manage and prioritize those resources to get competitive procurements done. Second, which folks also highlighted, is around limited procurement experience. For many agencies and staff, they may have never done an RFP or only done an RFP once in the last few years. So it can be extremely daunting to actually get started on that process and feel confident that they're following all the rules and procedures and effectively communicating with the vendor community. So that's definitely one that we're seeing in the chat as well. The third and fourth are actually almost in opposition of each other, but we've seen both. So the third bullet actually talks about how often it can be really challenging for an RFP writing team to balance different perspectives from across their agency. So program staff, fiscal staff, legal staff, senior leadership, they may all disagree on the vision for what should go into an RFP, and that can make it really difficult for whoever has the power of the pen to reconcile all those opinions. But on the flip side, sometimes you also have a situation where you have no input from subject matter experts to help you write the RFP. So we've definitely seen situations where someone is tasked to just go write an RFP, but they actually don't have the content they need to effectively populate that and communicate the need of the agency to the provider community. And then lastly, procurement can often be a very rushed, compliance-driven activity. I think we've definitely heard folks say they're so focused on making sure that they're following the rules and ethics towards doing a procurement effectively, which is very important, but there's less sort of creativity on the innovative aspect of effectively communicating to the vendor and provider community your needs. So one of the things that we're really going to talk about today is how to find that balance of ensuring that you're still kind of capturing all the things necessary to have a really ethical procurement process, but that's not preventing you from effectively finding the right vendors and communicating a document that's really digestible for the vendor and provider community to respond to. So Julie, if you go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about specific challenges with specific activities. So we talked a little bit about general challenges that agencies face. On the screen, you'll see 4 sort of buckets of typical procurement activities that can go wrong and sort of what the result is. So the first is that RFPs often don't have enough of a high-level overview of explaining to the provider or vendor community what you're actually trying to achieve with this service that you're procuring for. You might get really detailed on the specifications or explain all the rules of contracting with the state, but there's no actual part that in clear language just explains to vendors or providers what you need. And what that means is it makes it really difficult for vendors or providers to actually respond in a way that allows your evaluation team to figure out if they would be the right fit to contract with the state. So we'll talk a little bit about how to make sure that that's a key part of your RFP. The second activity is that often RFP writing teams face a lot of time pressure, and they're trying to get the RFP out the door as quickly as possible. Maybe there's senior leadership that says this needs to hit the street by the end of the month, or there's some sort of contract that's going to expire. And often what that means is that you actually end up having it go even longer, because as you go through approval processes within your agency, you realize that certain things are missing. So you have to kind of go back to the starting point and rehash all those early processes. Or even worse, you may release an RFP, but then because you were so rushed, you realize that certain pieces were missing and you end up having to reissue that RFP even after it's been made public and released on the street. The third activity, and Julia, I know, has been working very closely with agencies on procurement planning, but often agencies don't actually plan enough in advance to ensure that they can do a full competitive procurement cycle. So we often see that agencies will realize, oh, we have a contract or service that's expiring in 2 months. We don't actually have the time to go through a full-blown RFP process. And that means that there's not actually a strategic intention to make sure that those procurements are actually going out to bid. And that often can mean that even poor performing contracts keep getting renewed just because of those time pressures. So there are definitely situations where it makes sense to reprocure and extend contracts, or as Julia even talked about in the last training, go through a sole source procurement process. But OPM Finance is really trying to partner with agencies to make sure that planning and advanced planning is not the reason that's not taking place. And then lastly, often RFPs and the resulting contracts don't do a good enough job of actually tracking what success means. There's not actually sort of a component around performance metrics or vendor performance that could help inform the decision on whether to continue to reprocure for that service. So we're going to talk a lot about how to make sure that that's built into the original RFP and how that also then gets into the contract. So Julie, if you go to the next slide. So even for agencies that feel like you do a pretty decent job with writing RFPs and going through a competitive procurement process, we did want to flag some red flags, I know that's a pun, around what you should look at your agency to see if maybe there are ways that we can sort of improve our competitive procurement processes. So on the screen, you'll actually see 6 different bullets that talk about ways to sort of know if there's things that you should be looking for to improve your competitive procurement process. So the first we kind of already talked about, is there sort of a cycle of contracts just being renewed year after year, that there's not really any intentionality with your agency to sort of go through a competitive procurement process, at least with your most strategic contracts that are part of the portfolio of your agency. The second is that a lot of agencies will do a lot of competitive procurements, but their process is basically just to recycle old content from RFPs from decades ago. And that's not to say that you shouldn't leverage insights or content from past RFPs, but it's important to balance that with a fresh set of eyes and a new look to see if that actually still meets the needs of what your agency is looking for. So we really recommend that agencies, as they go through a competitive procurement process, bring that set of fresh eyes and don't just recycle old content from an RFP from 10 years ago. The third red flag is really around who's actually writing the RFP. So for some more sophisticated agencies, there are sort of procurement and contracting staff that can have the power of the pen, but we think it's really important to make sure that there are actual subject matter experts at your agency that are partnering with those folks to actually write the meat of the RFP, because ultimately they are the ones that are going to be able to best communicate to the vendor and provider community what the need is for your agency, rather than fiscal grants or even legal folks. The fourth bullet talks about how even with really well-written RFPs, the resulting contract could actually not connect to that RFP. So one thing that we're not going to talk about as much today, but definitely in future trainings, is how to ensure that if you have a well-written RFP, that content is then getting translated into the resulting contract in an effective way. And then lastly, even for agencies that do a lot of RFPs and go through a lot of competitive procurement processes, we have definitely seen, and this is not just in Connecticut, there can be little or no competition. It can be very frustrating to go through a 6-month process where you release an RFP and then only 1 or 2 vendors actually respond. And we'll talk a little bit today about why that might be happening. It could be that there's just a niche service, that there's just not a lot of competition, but it also could be in how you're communicating the needs of your agency to the vendor community that might be turning them off from actually responding. So we'll talk a little bit about that more today. And then the last bullet we talked about, but a lot of times agencies don't actually collect information about whether the service that they're procuring for is leading to the results that they wanted. So these are sort of all the red flags we wanted to talk through. Julie, if you go to the next slide. So that's all sort of the challenges and the negative stuff, but we want to pivot pretty quickly now to talking about, okay, so what do you do about this? How do we sort of ensure that our RFPs are well written, and how can OPM sort of be a partner in supporting that? So on the screen here, you'll actually see a series of components, and these are actually drafted by Lars and I as colleagues from across the country about the most important things that should be in RFPs. In addition to sort of any boilerplate provisions or information that the state needs to communicate to be in legal compliance, these are the more innovative and strategic pieces that we want to make sure are being communicated to vendors and providers. So the first, as we already kind of talked about, is there somewhere in your RFP where you are clearly explaining the challenge that your agency is facing and how you're hoping that that provider or vendor will meet that need? So that's almost the most critical thing. And when we talk about the templates that we started to create, you'll see that that information really should go as early as possible in the RFP and not be buried in the middle of the document. The second component is really about ensuring that you have a defined target or user population, being really clear to the vendor or provider community who you are trying to serve with this service. And especially in the social services world, it can be really important to help vendors or providers understand who you as an agency are really trying to meet, who's sort of eligible for your services, who's the priority population that you want to serve. All this can be really critical to directly communicate with vendors and providers. The third component is really around, and folks brought this up in the chat, how do you find the right balance in your scope of services description that both can be very clear and prescriptive about what you need, but that still invites innovation from vendors? I think, as a lot of folks know, vendors and providers, they can be the experts a lot of the time, and it's important to leverage their expertise through the RFP process. So how do you find that balance of communicating your need and explaining all the sort of policies and rules about serving your agency, but at the same time still have flexibility to ensure that vendors and providers can submit through their RFP responses how they would ultimately address your need? And then fourth is around performance metrics and a plan for managing performance. So as we talked about earlier, a lot of times agencies can struggle with ensuring that they actually can track whether the service is meeting the needs of their agency and the residents of Connecticut. So we'll talk about ensuring how, as early in the RFP process, you are putting out performance metrics to let vendors and providers know what's going to be tracked to actually ensure the success of the contract. And then how are you as an agency going to actually manage that performance? And then lastly, having a purposeful evaluation and selection process. So as I mentioned before, we're not going to talk as much about evaluation best practices, but that will definitely be a future training today. But we'll talk about how, as early as the RFP process, it can be really effective to be clear to vendors and providers about how you are going to evaluate them to ensure that their responses can best align to what your agency needs. So these are all the components. I know that's a lot of content, but you'll actually see that the template that we're going to share shortly completely aligns with these components and will make it very user-friendly and easy for you all to be able to automatically populate your RFPs with these components. So Julia, if you go to the next slide. So before we kind of continue with the presentation, we did want to pause again and see, after hearing a little bit about challenges and hearing a little bit about best practices with RFP writing, does anyone want to share through the chat examples of past RFPs or sections of RFPs that they thought were really effective or that they're proud of? And similarly, are there parts of the RFP writing process that you wish you had more guidance or support? So we'll give folks a couple minutes to brainstorm and share here as well. I know there's also some more logistical questions about whether this will be recorded and the slides shared, and we definitely will do that, like with the previous trainings. But yeah, if folks don't think we have any content yet, but definitely if folks feel like they have a specific example they want to share that they're proud of or that they wish they had more help, please do so.
Someone is saying that more support around data collection and evaluation would be really helpful.
That's good to know.
See if we can get a couple other comments before we move on. It'd be great. Someone is mentioning how it would be helpful to know how to provide background in the RFP so that applicants understand sort of where an agency is and where they need to go with the service that's being procured. That's a really good one.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think that's something that we've talked to folks in a lot of agencies about, really clarifying, especially for the provider community, what the outcome goals, so to speak, of a contract are, and how you're hoping to change the way services are delivered.
Someone's mentioned that their process has improved over the years, which is fantastic. And I joined the state a little under a year ago, and I've even seen some improvements since I joined. So I totally agree with that, and it's great to celebrate those improvements and successes.
And
I see someone also. Sorry, Colin, go ahead.
I was going to say, I also do want to point out that, Lars and I have been working in the state for a little over a year and a half, and we've definitely seen some incredible RFPs that have been written. I think Connecticut, in many ways, and many agencies are really at leading edge in terms of, counterparts that we've seen across the country. I think there are really great examples, and we want to make sure to celebrate those. So definitely our intention with this training is not to say that everything is negative and that we need to fully revamp the way that Connecticut does RFPs. There's some really great examples that we've seen over the last year and a half.
Absolutely. I'm seeing a couple more great points come in. Somebody's mentioned some more support in the evaluation process, which I think is a really good point. Those can be really challenging processes to navigate. Similarly, somebody has pointed out that interviews prior to selection, going back to that point about evaluation, can be really useful, and they found success there. I think that's great.
What do you say? Should we jump into the next slide?
That sounds great. And yeah, if folks still want to share anything in the chat, especially around parts that you wish you wanted more support, that would definitely be helpful as we get to the Q&A piece and as we think about how to sort of build off this training to better partner with agencies in the coming months.
Thank you all so much for your inputs. These are great, and we're really glad to sort of hear from you live.
Thanks, Julia. So before we kind of jump into some of the support tools that I know Lars, Julia, and myself want to share, we did want to kind of take a step back and explain why we're even talking about RFPs and RFP best practices today. I mean, how does this connect to Secretary McCaw's original agenda for sort of improving competitive procurement across the state, and ultimately, I think everyone's goals, which is ensuring that the residents of Connecticut are better served. So on the screen here is actually a theory of change of what can happen when RFPs are written effectively. So if you look at the left-hand side of the screen, that you'll see that RFPs that include many of these components that we talked about, that allows for applicants to ultimately provide better responses, to better allow for the state to evaluate whether this meets the needs of the agency and the residents of Connecticut. So that makes it a lot easier for evaluation teams at agencies to identify the right providers or vendors to contract with and service the state. So you'll see as we kind of move along this theory of change, what that can mean is if you ultimately get the right vendors or providers, it means that you then contract with these partners who are reinforcing all these expectations about what constitutes success for the life of the contract. So as we talk about the components of how to really write effective RFPs, our hope is that it sort of flows all the way through to contracts that are reinforcing this relationship, and ultimately that government and vendor and providers are collaborating together to continually improve service delivery for the state. So this is sort of the high-level view of why this matters, because ultimately well-written RFPs, they can make a huge difference for agencies and for the residents of Connecticut. So Julie, if you go to the next slide. So this talks a little bit, and we're going to jump into the first piece in a moment, about the overview of OPM support that's available to agencies. So as Julia mentioned, the OPM finance team, through Secretary McCaw's directive, is really encouraging agencies to increase their percentage of competitive procurements. But as Julia and Kim alluded to, agencies are not alone. OPM really wants to be a partner in supporting more RFP writing and more competitive procurements across the state. So the rest of this presentation is going to be about sharing some of the early tools that we've developed to help support agencies in that competitive procurement process. So we're going to talk directly about 2 different RFP templates that are available to agencies, especially for newer folks to sort of navigate the RFP writing process. Lars is then going to talk about sort of a structured series of support that the GPL will be offering, as well as Julia, to agencies in the summer and fall. And then we're also going to talk about more lighter touch technical assistance. So for agencies that don't want to go through a full-blown partnership with OPM, but are just looking for additional tools, we'll kind of talk about what some of that looks like, as well as just offering that Julia, myself, and Lars are happy at any moment to sort of jump on the phone and answer any questions about the RFP writing process. So Julia, if you go to the next slide.
And I just want to interrupt you very quickly, Colin, to announce that I reshared the link to the PSA RFP template in the announcements. So you can feel free to download it to follow along if you'd like, but you absolutely don't have to. These materials will be available after the training, so you can sort of just pay attention now and look on, or download if you'd like. So back to you, Colin.
Thanks, Julia. So yeah, so the next few slides, we're actually going to walk through the RFP templates that we've been talking about. And the first slide is really actually to provide a little bit of context for sort of how these came to be, so folks can kind of understand where these started and sort of what our hope is in the future with these templates. So on the left-hand side of the screen, and apologies if this is a little bit small, but these are actually the cover pages of the templates themselves. So it's actually the second page of the template for those who are following along on the link. So there are actually two separate RFP templates that we've built. One that is specifically for RFPs that will result in POS contracts, and one that will be for RFPs that will result in PSAs. So one thing to note is that we've actually, over the last few months, been co-developing these templates with many sister agencies that are on the call today. And then we've actually been really fortunate to actually pilot them on several recent RFPs. So what's exciting is that these templates have actually been pressure test in a pretty effective way to make sure that we're capturing the right content, to find that balance of, are we ensuring that all the proper provisions are being shared with vendors and providers around state practices, but also kind of ensuring that folks who are newer to RFP writing are navigating these templates in a way that's understandable and that makes them feel empowered to write really effective RFPs. So our hope with these templates is that they make the RFP writing process more efficient for government staff. So you'll see as you kind of walk through the document, there's really helpful sort of boilerplate text throughout that allows you to sort of just not have to worry too much about standard provisions. But then there's also pieces that offer instructions and guidance that you as an agency can kind of work through to populate and work with the different folks in your agency to ensure that those pieces are getting populated. So that's sort of the first goal, make this a more efficient process for government staff. The second goal is that we also want to make this a more standardized experience for vendors and providers. As many of you know, vendors and providers, they often contract with multiple state agencies, and it can be very confusing for them if they're navigating multiple RFPs that have information that is structured in very different ways. So our hope is that by having a more standardized template, that experience for vendors and providers as they navigate the RFP process will be a lot more consistent, and they'll know where to find the key information they need to ultimately respond effectively to RFPs. But at the same time, even though it's a more standardized template, there's still a lot of flexibility within the document for agencies to customize to meet their needs. So we definitely know that certain agencies have very specific ways that they want to communicate information, and we think this template still finds the right balance to allow you all to do that. So again, you'll see that there's two separate templates. I know Julia's only shared the PSA template, but after the training, we will be sure to share both templates so folks can see the differences. And then lastly, I'll just mention the templates are still somewhat iterative, even though we've been piloting them and modifying them. As agencies start to use them, we definitely welcome feedback on additional suggestions or changes, because we definitely understand that as you sort of try these out, there'll be additional things that we can do to make them even better. So that's sort of the context. Julia, if you go to the next slide. So in the first page of the template is actually an instruction page. So even for those who haven't watched this training or don't know anything about what the templates are, if they came across this document, they would see sort of on the first page guidance for how you as an RFP writer or RFP writing team should use this template. So it sort of explains a lot of the reasoning behind why OPM has developed this template. And then it sort of explains sort of how to navigate this document as actual RFP writers. So it will explain that much of the document, the actual template itself, includes boilerplate text that does not need to be edited unless your agency has specific provisions that they need to change. So it makes it much easier that it's all in one place. You're not trying to chase down old RFPs to remember all the mandatory information that you need as boilerplate text. You'll also then see that the instructional page explains the difference between sections that have gray highlighted text and blue highlighted text. So the blue highlighted text is actually information that is just for you as an RFP writing team. It's sort of tips and tricks as you're going through the writing process. That should be removed before you actually finalize and release the RFP. And we try to make that clear throughout the template so you don't accidentally leave in that instructional guidance for vendors and providers to see. There's also gray highlighted text, which are actually more just plug and chug information that you as an agency just need to populate with your specific agency practices or specific information that may relate to that RFP itself. So that's sort of the big difference. Blue text is sort of more tips and tricks. Gray are sort of things you just need to plug in based on your own agency needs or RFP needs. And then the last thing I'll say about this instructional page is that you as an agency should still work with your contracting or legal teams to make sure that there's not additional agency-specific guidelines that should be included. But our hope is that this template is a great starting point as an RFP writing team is going through the process to meet the needs of most state agencies. So Julie, if you go to the next slide. So the next part of the template I want to talk through is the table of contents. And the reason I actually want to do this is to explain a little bit around the structure of the document and to explain sort of why we've organized information in a certain logical way. So for folks who actually saw, there was a previous OPM RFP template back in 2013 that I know a lot of agencies still use that was very effective and it had all the right content. But the way that it was ordered often meant that the most critical information was actually buried in the middle or the end of the document. So one of our goals when we were talking and partnering with sister agencies on redesigning this template was figuring out how to put the most critical content up front. So as vendors and providers open the RFP, the first thing that they're seeing is the information that's most critical for them to actually respond to the RFP. So you'll see through the table of contents that the template is actually organized in that fashion. So the first section is actually the most critical logistical and introductory information that the vendors or providers need to respond to the RFP. There's then very quickly a section that provides all the details about the service need itself. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but it's really critical that agencies pretty quickly actually communicate to vendors and providers, what are you looking to procure for and what is the service need of your agency? This is then followed by sort of proposal submission requirements. And lastly, the mandatory and boilerplate information, which is more legal information, which is obviously important, that's more at the end of the document because that's pretty standardized. And for more experienced vendors, they've seen a lot of that content many times as they've worked with the state. So the goal is to kind of put that towards the end so it's not cluttering the more customized and new language that's coming earlier in the document. Julie, if you want to go to the next slide. So the next 3 slides are really kind of trying to explain some of the parts of the template that we've definitely gotten some feedback around confusion. And I do want to just point out, in addition to the Q&A period, Julia, Lars, and myself are happy at any point to connect with agencies to walk through the template at a more individualized level and answer specific questions. But we did want to, for this training, at least call out a couple of the pieces that we've definitely heard some confusion from folks who've been trying this out and piloting. So the first is on the department overview and service overview section. So for those who are actually following along in the template itself, on page 9, there's actually a section that talks about populating your department overview, which I think a lot of folks are pretty familiar with, right? This is background information about your agency, explaining to vendors and providers sort of your agency vision, your values, potentially the history of your organization. And then depending on the RFP, you might even get more specific about the division or program team that's overseeing or implementing this service. So that's sort of one piece of this section. But the second piece, which we think is really important to actually capture that best practice that we talked about explaining the service need, is that you have a specific service overview section where you very directly describe the problem you're trying to solve. Before you actually get into the specifics of describing the scope of services, take a step back and actually communicate to vendors and providers what is the problem that your agency is facing and how are you hoping that vendors or providers will partner with you to solve that. And that includes actually listing out specific outcome goals of what success for this contract means to you. So this section, and there's all these tips and tricks throughout this section that we put in there, will hopefully be a really effective way to communicate with vendors and providers about that need. And that can include additional information like your vision for a successful service, and if this happens to be a reprocurement, priorities for changes from your current contract that you'd really like to see. So this is sort of the difference between the department overview and the service overview. So Julie, if you go to the next slide. The next piece that we've definitely seen some confusion and definitely want to walk through is the difference of this between the scope of service description and proposal requirements. So I think a lot of folks are familiar with what we mean by scope of service description. This is where you're explaining in very candid terms to providers and vendors what are the primary services and tasks that need to be performed. And we're highly encouraging agencies, and the template helps walk you through this, to have multiple subsections that explain either by category or type of work what those different services or tasks that are needed. So you make it very clear and easy for vendors and providers to understand the different components if they were awarded of what they would have to do. What we want to make clear, and we've definitely gotten feedback from vendors and providers, not just in Connecticut, but across the country, is it's really important to keep this section clean from any actual proposal questions. You want to keep this section to be just around what are you actually expecting an awarded vendor or provider if they got this contract. You don't want to actually have language in here that says, you need to respond in your RFP response to a specific question here. You want to put that all in a separate section, which we're calling proposal requirements. So that it's really simple for vendors and providers to understand what do they actually have to submit in their package in responding to the RFP. So that's the first piece, is understanding scope of service should just be information that you are communicating to vendors and providers, not actually things that you're expecting them to respond to. The second piece is that a scope of service description is actually different from what many agencies consider templated scope of service language that you might have approved from the AG, or even historical contract language. Those things are very valuable, and you might want to allude to them in the RFP, have them as attachments, maybe provide a link. But we want to make sure that the actual scope of service description is more non-legal language to really explain in a clear way to vendors what your service expectations are. So again, not kind of bombarding them with contract terms or legal provisions that might be confusing. So that's really what we're hoping to capture in the scope of service description section. Now, on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see proposal requirements. These are all the things, and this is going to actually be on page 19 of the template, that vendors and providers, excuse me, it's actually page 18, that vendors and providers will have to submit to be responsive to the RFP. So these are all the things that folks are probably familiar with, a cover sheet, an executive summary, answers to your series of proposal questions, any supplementary attachments. This is all what's going to go into that section to explain in one place, in one section, how vendors and providers should respond to the RFP. For the part where you're actually asking specific questions to check, how effective the vendor or provider would be in meeting your need, those primary proposal questions, they can be structured in this section, numerically or by category. Another option is you actually could create a separate attachment that they just populate directly, which could be a Word document or an Excel document. So our hope here is that you're kind of making very clear what are the things that they need to respond to. And you definitely can allude back to things that were referenced in the scope of service. But again, just very clearly in this section explaining what you're looking for vendors and providers to submit in their package. And then lastly, this section should also include instructions on how to submit proposals, and the template helps walk you through this. And especially given COVID, we are highly encouraging that agencies move towards electronic submissions, where you're making it as easy as possible for vendors and providers to submit this information. And we also highly encourage that you put length limits on these proposals, because I think as everyone who's done competitive procurements can relate to, you want to make it as easy for evaluation teams as possible to digest this information. They don't want to have hundreds of pages of marketing materials from vendors and providers. So it can be really helpful to force vendors and respondents to actually narrow down the amount of content that they share in response to your RFP. So hopefully that helps explain these two sections, and definitely we know that this still creates a lot of confusion. So happy to walk through this during the Q&A as well. So Julie, if you go to the next slide. So the last piece before we kind of close out talking about the template is around the difference between performance measures and service level agreements. So as we talked about before around the challenges that a lot of agencies have about not actually tracking whether the services are meeting their needs, this is our goal, that in the RFP process itself, that you'll start to actually introduce performance measures to help track the success of the contract. Now, what's important is that these performance measures, especially in the social services realm, that they include benchmarks and targets of sort of what you're expecting the vendor to ultimately be working towards to actually meet your need. And if you don't have those targets, it's totally okay to be more directional in your goal of saying that, we're hoping to increase the percentage of, families that are enrolled in this service, or, seeing a decrease in something. That's totally fine too. Often these performance measures actually might have performance incentives that are tied to them. We know a lot of agencies are piloting with things like bonus payments to actually further incentivize that agencies meet these outcome goals. But the most important piece to understand about performance measures is that these are a tool for collaboration with vendors and providers. It's supposed to be part of an ongoing conversation to improve performance. They are not contractual obligations that would result in breach if vendors and providers do not meet them. That is actually what's on the right-hand side of the screen. That is what we talk about as service level agreements, where you have actual contractual expectations that if vendors and providers do not meet certain metrics, that they will be in breach of the contract. So we think it's really important that you differentiate between things that you're tracking to sort of work with vendors and providers in a collaborative way to improve service delivery versus things that you absolutely expect them to be hitting and meeting on day one, or they will be in breach. And those service level agreements, that should be in your scope of service description, where you're explaining sort of what must happen if you were awarded as a vendor. So those service level agreements are much less a tool for performance monitoring in a collaborative way, and much more of a must-have service requirement that you're putting into contract language. So that's the last sort of piece that I wanted to talk through in terms of clarifying sections. The last thing I wanted to say about the template before handing things over to Lars is a couple final additional tips and tricks. So the first bullet is actually very important, because I think, as some folks might be aware, there's actually recent legislation that is moving through and is being approved that might actually impact some of the templated content. So in the next couple of weeks, we know that DAS and OPM and the AG's office is actually working through operationalizing some of that. So definitely be on the lookout for additional guidance that's going to come out to explain how these templates will change. But for now, this is sort of the law of the land, and these templates are sort of up to date at this point. But definitely be on the lookout for those changes. The second tip is that there's a reference to a contract management section, which is actually on page 12. And that kind of is an opportunity for agencies to explain how you are going to work with providers and vendors to manage the contract and to collaboratively ensure that service delivery is improving. So there's some really good tips and tricks there to think about language to communicate to vendors and providers how you as an agency will be a partner in that effort. The third bullet is around the evaluation criteria section. So that is actually on page 15 and 16, and just wanted to clarify that there's actually two options presented in the template for how to display evaluation criteria, and it's completely up to agencies to choose whether they want to do a more bare bones version or a more detailed information for that section. So definitely the template explains this, but don't include both. You only have to choose one. And then lastly, the final tip and trick is that there's a proposal checklist section at the end of the document on page 30. That really sort of is supposed to be just a one-stop shop for vendors to look at the end of the document to make sure, as they are pulling together their application materials, that they've covered all their bases. So this is definitely something that should be customized by agencies as you're writing the RFP to put that all in one place for agencies. And if there's for vendors, if there's confusion around this section, you definitely don't have to use it, but make sure that if you keep it in the template when you release this to the public, that you customize this and sort of make sure that that information is up to date. So that's sort of the final tips and tricks. I know that was a lot of content. And again, I wanted to offer that we'll be happy to talk more about it during the Q&A period, but Julia, Lars, and myself are also happy to walk through this template with agencies as you get a chance to kind of dive in and read through the document. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Lars to talk about the second piece of support that GPL and OPM Finance are offering to agencies about sprints.
Thanks, Colin. So now that we've presented the advantages of the POS and PSA RFP templates, the first item on this list of support options you see on the right of the slide, I'm going to take a few minutes to walk through the other forms of technical assistance that OPM and the GPL can offer to support agencies' RFP development. And we're going to start with RFP sprints. So you can go to the next slide, Julia. Thanks. So for those of you who have not worked with the GPL in one of our RFP sprints in the past, the sprint approach is really rooted in an understanding that complex RFP processes often call for more intensive technical assistance to use that results-driven RFP template effectively. Those sprints can also provide a really great low-pressure environment in which staff can learn to use the RFP template, and an opportunity for professional development and skill building as staff really take the lead and take ownership over the RFPs that they create in the sprint process. What we do in a sprint is we assemble an RFP writing team, which is generally anywhere between 10 or 20 staff from an agency, usually across procurement, program, fiscal, and potentially even legal departments, for a series of weekly meetings in which we collaboratively develop RFP content, taking on a new section of the RFP each week. A sprint can be right-sized to fit the complexity of the RFP in question, but generally it's a process that lasts between 4 to 7 weeks, and it can include staff from across the agency depending on the specifications of the RFP, or even staff from multiple agencies. The process is a really great vehicle to encourage cross-team collaboration with both procurement and user agency staff. So it's a great opportunity for folks who work with DAS procurement on goods and services to really build those relationships as well, and identify opportunities across human service agencies where similar needs can be procured using the same RFP. It also offers a standardized approach to generate the building blocks of one of these effective outcome-focused RFPs that we've been talking about, much like the template does, which makes it a really great companion for demonstrating to staff how to effectively leverage that template in their future RFP processes as well. An RFP sprint can also include multiple RFPs and multiple teams across agencies, which provides a great opportunity for horizontal feedback and knowledge sharing between some of those silos that we so often find ourselves in human services in the state. In the summer and the fall of 2021, the GPL team, which is myself, Colin, and our colleague Anne, is planning to host 2 more results-driven contracting sprints to complement sprints that we ran in the winter and spring. We're hoping to support human service agencies that are navigating complex or challenging RFP processes. And past sprints have helped agencies shorten RFP timelines by months. I'm sure that many folks in this call, I believe we saw a comment from Elaine, who's a great partner who we worked with in DEEP, about the quality of those RFP sprints and how useful a tool they can really be in accelerating those long RFP processes. Agencies that are interested in participating, if you have an RFP that you think would be a great candidate over that next few months, should reach out to myself or Colin, and we'll provide our emails a little bit further along in this presentation. You can also always get in touch with us via OPM Finance and Julia. So to give you an example of a sprint outline, you can see on the right how each week of the sprint includes a workshop that addresses a new section of the RFP. And we cap the whole process off with a section on RFP assembly that can establish a clear roadmap and next steps to get the RFP through final approval stages and onto the street. The sprint is also a really great opportunity to familiarize an evaluation committee with the RFP content and the evaluation process, which, as we all know, can often be opaque and confusing. By bringing in that evaluation team at the beginning of the process and inviting them to be part of a sprint like this, you're also giving them an opportunity to weigh in and provide their own programmatic expertise to help shape the content of the RFP and make it clear to the vendor and provider communities exactly the goals that the state is looking to achieve. In a typical week, and you can see an example of that weekly schedule on the bottom of this slide, that workshop will be followed by what we call a prep assignment, in which a smaller RFP drafting team, usually 3 or 5 people from the larger sprint group, will apply the strategies and the content that we brainstorm together in the workshop to write the corresponding RFP section. We then review those RFP sections as the full group at the beginning of the next workshop, and we have an opportunity to discuss whether further edits can be made. The goal of that approach is to ensure that there are lots of perspectives in the room and that everyone has a chance to weigh in on the content of an RFP, particularly those who are going to be tasked with implementing the service or the good that the RFP is procuring for. But we also maintain a consistent voice in the RFP, which is really helpful in terms of providing clarity to the vendor and provider community. And we provide opportunities for group members on that RFP drafting team to take on leadership roles and really take ownership of the content of the RFP. That approach also establishes accountability to ensure that we keep making progress with that smaller group of partners. So you can go to the next slide, Julia. Thank you. RFP sprints have a number of great benefits, and this slide is just a small selection of the ways in which this can improve an RFP process. So we improve stakeholder communication within and across agencies, which is really important by minimizing that back and forth that RFP processes also see further down the line. We really ensure that we're running an efficient and effective RFP process. We provide a forcing mechanism on some of those key RFP writing decisions. I'm sure those of us on the call who have written RFPs in the past are familiar with the feeling of sitting down to write and just realizing that there are questions that you didn't even think of that you need to answer, or that others in your agency need to answer before you can start writing the RFP. We create a learning environment that empowers staff to adopt new approaches and apply these methodologies to future procurements. So the whole idea of a sprint process is to give you, as contract specialists, as procurement and program staff, the tools that you need to leverage these strategies into the future and build your own professional skill set. And finally, we engage senior government leadership by bringing in folks in managerial and supervisory roles into these sprints in the procurement process to elevate the importance of procurement as a strategic tool that advances an agency's goals, not just confined to that individual RFP process, but in a larger sense, making sure that every RFP that an agency puts out, every procurement that you do, is building towards your values and your goals as an agency. And just to reiterate one more time, we are planning to run several more of these sprints in the next year, including in the summer and the fall. So if you're going to be working on an RFP in the next few months that you think would be a good subject for one of those sprints, definitely reach out to Colin or myself and let us know you're interested, and we'll set up a conversation to talk about next steps. Next slide, please, Julia. Thank you. So in situations where an RFP sprint is not feasible, whether due to timing or the complexity of the RFP or other features about the team, but additional support is still useful, we also offer some lower investment resources, including the RFP Getting Started worksheet, which is a really helpful tool that condenses sprint exercises and results-driven contracting strategies into a single 90-minute session that RFP specialists can put on. The GPL RFP Guidebook, which is a procurement professional's best friend in this confusing world, which contains guidance, templates, and useful tips that help contract specialists write high-quality RFPs. And of course, the OPM finance team, Julia, Colin, and myself, who are always available to answer questions, provide advice, or to help facilitate any of these meetings or other support mechanisms. So I'll walk through each of these in the next few slides. So starting with the Getting Started worksheet, we definitely understand that even when using the RFP template and similar tools, the RFP drafting process is still challenging and long and really intimidating, especially at the outset, when you know that you need to procure for a service, but you don't quite have all the information that you need to start writing. Often RFPs require input and support from many different stakeholders, particularly to answer important questions about the content of the RFPs. Questions like, what metrics are you going to use to track vendor performance? How are you going to collect the data? What criteria are you going to use to evaluate proposals, and how are you going to write proposal questions that reflect those criteria and ensure that you're collecting the information from vendors that you need to evaluate the proposals relative to your outcome goals. The Getting Started worksheet is a much lighter touch way to get those stakeholders from program, procurement, and legal teams all in the same room to answer those questions at the outset of the RFP process. That expedites the RFP process by ensuring that when you sit down to write the RFP, you actually have all the information and all the buy-in that you need. So the Getting Started worksheet is formatted as a PowerPoint deck, and you can see an example of one of the slides from that deck on the bottom right that's broken down into 4 topics, which is a lot like a smaller scale version of our sprint schedule. You can see even the color coding is the same. Each topic includes key questions to guide discussion and gather necessary information on subcategories like, you can see we've taken solicitation overview topic as an example, the problem statement, the outcome goals, and the target population, which are the elements of that solicitation overview you'll also find in the RFP template. We find that a single 90-minute session to answer these questions can shave weeks off of the end of the RFP process and save a lot of headaches and confusion down the road. And of course, Colin and Julia and myself are always really happy to support agencies in facilitating these sessions or using this deck. You're going to be able to find that PowerPoint along with instructions and tips for effectively using it on the OPM website. In the same place, you'll be able to find the procurement standards and the POS and PSA templates, along with a number of other helpful resources. Next slide, please, Julia. Thank you. GPL's RFP Guidebook is the last useful tool that I want to share here. And it's useful both as a complement to the OPM RFP template or on its own as a useful resource for folks in procurement. This guidebook was created by GPL staff based on their experiences and the best practices that we've gathered from many years of working on procurement projects with states and cities and counties across the country. It's designed to support contract specialists and teams through every stage of the RFP process, planning, including assembling a strong project team, how to navigate that process, drafting the actual RFP, releasing the RFP on the street and ensuring that you get lots of respondents by navigating really effective Q&A periods and pre-bidder conferences, and the evaluation process, how to clarify for an evaluation team how to navigate that process, how to maintain confidentiality and impartiality throughout, and all these other great tips and tricks to make sure that your RFP process is effective and consistent and produces really high quality services. For each stage in that process and each section of an RFP document, this guidebook has guidelines, useful brainstorming prompts, examples of RFP content, and templates to complete, including templates like a template contract management plan, a template for evaluation criteria, a template for a cost proposal, and many other somewhat challenging pieces of assembling an RFP that it makes a little bit easier for you. It also includes explanations of common challenges and pitfalls that we've encountered, so you can ensure that your RFP process isn't derailed by any of those. The guidebook finally gives you a great sense of the theory behind these RFP writing strategies, which is a reason that I in particular really like it. So you can understand not just what makes an RFP good and effective, but why, and how those quality RFPs actually lead to more responses and more impactful services and better results for the residents that we're trying to serve. Go to the next slide, please, Julia. So hopefully all of the tools that we shared today are going to help you write excellent RFPs that garner plenty of high quality responses and help you find great vendors and great providers. But another important piece of that process is ensuring that those vendors and providers can actually find and respond to the RFPs that you post. So I know that a lot of you have heard this spiel already, but CT Source is the new state contracting portal, and it will let you immediately distribute your RFPs to hundreds of qualified vendors. As many of you have definitely heard by now, BizNet is being sunset, and so all new agency RFPs need to be posted to CT Source instead. OPM is planning to run a future joint training with DAS on how to effectively manage vendor outreach during CT Source later this year. We'll go over all those features that you can see in the slide here, such as how you monitor vendor interest using the platform, how you post and distribute RFPs, how you run Q&As, and how you can read and score proposals directly on CT Source and minimize the need for all that email-based back and forth. There are also updates to CT Source that are coming later this year that, among other great features, are going to allow agencies to evaluate vendor performance and read other agencies' vendor evaluations, which will make that process of factoring past performance into the procurement process much more impartial, objective, and useful for folks who choose to do that as part of evaluation. For now, if you want any support with the CT Source platform, you can also reach out to DAS directly at das.ctsource@ct.gov for support on using CT Source and ensuring that the vendors and providers in your agency's network are aware of how to register and find your RFPs. So you can also always contact us at OPM Finance for help. And here we've listed our contact information. Julia Fussfeld, who spoke to you earlier, is the Procurement Policy Development Coordinator, and that's her email there. Colin and myself are fellows with the GPL who can support you on things like RFP sprints or RFP writing. Those are our emails there. And of course, Kimberly Kennison, who generously kicked off this training session, you can contact at her email there. These contacts are for procurement-related questions, of course. Agencies might also have questions around budget or budgeting, and for those types of questions or queries, your agency will have an assigned contact in the OPM budget division who you can reach out to. That's it for us. So I think now we're going to turn it over to Julia to lead us through question and answer.
Thanks so much, Colin and Lars, for that great walkthrough of all the resources we have available. Everyone should feel free to ping us in the Q&A box with your questions, and we'll get to as many as we can today. I think one that we got earlier is you talked a little bit about how if and someone on this training thinks that they have a good candidate for an RFP sprint, they should contact you. Can you tell us a little bit more about what makes an RFP a good candidate for a sprint?
Sure, Lars, you want me to take that first, then definitely feel free to chime in.
Yeah, go for it.
Great. So I think, first thing I'll say is I'll kind of describe where we've seen successful RFP candidates for the sprint, but also definitely feel free to reach out to us and we can talk a little bit more about the individual example, because we're happy to kind of see, even if it's not a candidate for a sprint, how we could best support it. But I'd say in general, where we've seen the most successful RFPs for sprints are for a couple of reasons. So number one is that there's some sense of urgency around getting the RFP completed, but not so much that it prevents you from being sort of strategic in how you approach drafting it. So if the RFP needs to hit the street in a week or 2 weeks, it's probably not the right candidate. It's sort of more of an RFP that's probably going to try to hit the street in a few months or even as far out as 6 months, so that you're able to kind of go through the workshops in a way that's not super stressful, that you're feeling like you need to get this done as quickly as possible. The second thing I'd say that's really important about a sprint RFP sprint candidate is that it's something that you actually could benefit from additional collaboration either within your agency or even from sister agencies. So is the content of the sprint something that's like there isn't just sort of one expert in your agency that knows everything and wants to write it, but there actually could be a benefit from bringing different stakeholders together to sort of align on your priorities. Because a big part of the sprint is sort of helping you navigate that process of figuring out how to build consensus across your agency and your team. And then lastly, I would say, we've also seen really successful sprint candidates for something that is sort of more service oriented and where there is pieces of the RFP that sort of align well with some of those results-driven contracting components that we talked about. So could you imagine that there's a real need for having performance measures that you want to track, that there's a need to sort of have a more thoughtful approach to contract management? If that sort of aligns with sort of what you're trying to achieve with the RFP, then it's definitely a great candidate for the sprint. But Lars, anything else you wanted to add?
The only other thing I would say is we're also always looking for really exciting opportunities to collaborate across agencies and spread these strategies more broadly. So we recently worked on a sprint with some of our partners at DSS and DDS, who had a really interesting RFP that they were working on trying to collaborate across agencies to do. And a sprint is a great platform for that, right? Because what a sprint ultimately does is bring together stakeholders from across divisions or across agencies and encourages them to communicate and collaborate effectively. So if you have situations like that where your agency and another agency have a similar need you'd like to collaborate with on an RFP, that's always a great example of a really high quality sprint.
Awesome. Thank you. That was a super comprehensive answer. And just one follow-up to that, is it appropriate for new RFP writing staff or RFP beginners to participate in a sprint?
Absolutely. Yeah, staff of all experience levels, all levels of comfort with procurement are very, very welcome to participate in the sprint. I think one of the big advantages that we have found in a sprint is that because so many of our activities revolve around encouraging folks to share their own experiences and their own reflections, their own ideas, we really see this great merging of knowledge and this great brain trust that's created where newer staff bring innovative perspectives that others may not have considered to the sprint process and are really great voices in the room. And older staff frequently bring those really experienced and thoughtful perspectives from RFP processes that they've worked on before. So that's absolutely great to see, and we welcome RFP beginners, so to speak, to join these trainings.
And the other thing that I'd add on that front is we've also in past sprints, even if your agency wasn't formally participating because you didn't have an RFP that was ready, if you did have sort of newer staff or staff that you wanted exposed to this type of concept, we were allowing for what we called sort of sprint auditors to join. So as schedules permitted, we would have folks from agencies sort of join and sort of listen in to sort of understand the principles of what was happening with the sprint, even if you didn't actually have an RFP that your agency was working on. And we would just kind of work with the primary RFP writing teams to make sure they were comfortable and make sure that everyone was signing any confidentiality requirements during that process.
Fantastic, thanks. I think that was really helpful. I know there's some enthusiasm in the chat for having beginners and newer members join. So hopefully that answers that and encourages all folks with all different experience levels to think about how they can participate in a sprint. I just want to encourage folks to continue sending in questions. We know we covered a lot of content, so definitely don't be shy. The next one that I'll pose to Colin and Lars is that you mentioned an RFP template for PSAs and one for POSs. Is there another template that OPM has developed for other types of contracts?
So I think, Julia, at this point, I think you might have responded directly in the chat too. I think our focus has been, because OPM Finance sort of oversees procurement policy specifically for PSAs and POSs, that's been the focus for these templates. I will say, and hopefully there's some DAS folks on the call as well. We've definitely been working with DAS procurement as well to sort of work with them on their own templates that they use within CT Source. And definitely as we kind of continue that process with DAS staff, those hopefully will also be available to agencies as well, especially when they work with contract specialists directly at DAS procurement. Yeah.
I did respond to that, but I just thought maybe other folks could benefit from learning a little bit about sort of those different authorities as well if you didn't attend our our first training session back in February. Another question that came up, this is a little bit related to the way we use the RFP templates. Once I've written an RFP, is there like a standard amount of time that an RFP should be out on the street? Is that included in the RFP template or other guidance?
Yeah, Julie, I don't know if you want to allude to OPM procurement policies on this. The RFP guidebook, I think Lars actually does have some language on this. The templates themselves don't, but so in OPM's procurement standards, Julie, do you want to kind of highlight what OPM's encouraging, and then we can talk through some of the trade-offs that we've definitely seen?
I think we tend to encourage around 7 to 8 weeks as a sort of standard practice. And that's because it takes, if you've written a really good RFP, you want to make sure that the potential respondents have the time to be as thoughtful in their responses and really come up with the best possible solution to the problem that you're looking to solve. That being said, it's not a hard and fast rule, and I think you know, we can certainly approve instances where it doesn't have to be on the street quite as long. And maybe Colin, I can kick it back to you to talk a little bit about what factors might be considered for that.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right, Julie. I think, you know, anytime you're deciding how long to have the RFP on the street for vendors and providers to respond, there's trade-offs. So I think obviously, you know, you have a need as an agency and you're trying to address that as quickly as possible. So I think it's always important as you're going through the planning process with procurements to think about, you know, trying to protect that time. As Julia mentioned, it's really important to sort of give the space for vendors and providers to thoughtfully respond. And candidly, you know, vendors and providers might not actually see the RFP until a couple weeks into when it was released. So if you shorten beyond sort of, you know, 7 to 8 weeks, you can get into a situation where a respondent might only have a week or two to actually draft an effective proposal. So definitely encourage agencies to do their best to try to keep a pretty lengthy period. But if, you know, timelines come into play where you have to shorten that, then I think there's other things you should consider, like how do you limit the number of proposal questions that you're asking to make it simpler to respond to sort of mitigate against the shorter time period.
I think the other thing I would quickly add to that is certainly the time on the street matters a lot, but it also matters what you're doing while the RFP is on the street, right? So something that we do try to encourage folks to think about is, you know, there are opportunities to do pre-bidder conferences, for example, where you can give vendors a little bit of a better picture of what you're trying to get out of the RFP and out of the service. That certainly helps them respond. We also definitely try to encourage agencies to do outreach to the vendor community to whatever extent they can, with the understanding that sometimes just posting an RFP on CT Source or previously on BizNet is not necessarily enough to attract the kind of qualified vendors you might need to provide your service. So thinking about whether there are, you know, email lists that you can access, intermediary organizations like chambers of commerce that you can contact to help distribute the RFP, any kind of effort like that that gets the RFP in front of more eyes during that period of on the street time is always helpful to ensuring that vendors have a chance to see it and respond.
Yeah, so as you can see, there's some variety and mitigating factors that can help you make that choice. And if you ever do want to consult us on how long something needs to be on the street, feel free to reach out. Another question that has come up, and I do want to keep encouraging folks to submit questions since we do have a little bit more time in the training. This is a great opportunity to address any confusion because I know we covered a lot. But going back to sort of the meat of the RFP, Colin and Lars, should RFPs be written broadly to give some flexibility in managing a contract, or should they be written more specifically so that a program manager has like the opportunity to approve minor changes?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think, Lars, definitely welcome your thoughts here. I think there always has to be a balance, right? I think a lot of times it will depend on the commodity or service that you're procuring for. So especially in the social services world, we know often agencies are actually procuring for evidence-based models where there actually might be very prescriptive requirements for how a service is delivered. And in those cases, you know, it's obviously critical that you communicate that to providers and vendors about what those expectations are, and they may be very specific. Or for an agency that has an existing service that's fulfilled by a contract and they're really happy with it, if you do want to communicate sort of what's made that successful, it's definitely okay to be somewhat prescriptive in the parts that you feel like really align with advancing your agency priorities. At the same time, though, I think, you know, anytime you're going through a reprocurement, there is a real opportunity to leverage the expertise of vendors and providers to bring new ideas to bear. So I think you always kind of want to think about am I writing this RFP in a way that's so specific and narrow that I'm actually going to, prevent vendors or providers from bringing innovative ideas to the table because they think the state knows exactly what they want, and I'm just going to respond to exactly meet that need. So, we're definitely happy to be resources to help look through any RFPs that you're drafting and help you navigate that balance.
Great. Lars, was there anything that you wanted to add?
No, that was perfect. Colin nailed it, as always.
Great. I think we do have some time for a couple more. So we have a question here that someone noticed that there's a section on font size and margins and other requirements, and this person is concerned that that might discourage small businesses or smaller organizations from responding because it's so specified. Have you seen that come up in other places, and how would you sort of address that concern?
Yeah, so one thing that I'll point out, I think that actual section, we definitely welcome agencies to customize that. I think the goal, this actually came from the original template that we did sort of want to ensure that in proposal responses that there was sort of a consistent font being used, so you're not having situations that evaluation teams are like reading drastically different types of proposals. But I think, definitely agencies can feel free to customize and look into ways to make that less burdensome. I think for the most part, small vendors are less concerned about sort of font size. And I think the bigger piece is sort of just looking through the full piece of how they have to submit their proposal. Are you making it sort of as simple and easy as possible for them to respond? So I think those are kind of the bigger pieces. But Lars, anything else you'd add on that front?
The only other thing I would say on that, Colin, is I think it's important for agencies to have conversations, especially as proposals are coming in and you're doing that initial check to make sure that they meet those minimum requirements, about what of those minimum requirements are sort of nice to haves or useful for reviewing proposals and what actually invalidates a proposal. So just to give examples, I've been on evaluation committees in the past where we've seen, their vendors will be asked to submit a digital copy of their proposal, so it can be evaluated, over Teams in sort of a work from home situation. And vendors have submitted many pages of photocopied or scanned copies of a physical copy that makes it really hard, right, to review those proposals online. So that's maybe an area where you can go back to vendors and ask for them to make corrections to their proposal. You may also think about kind of technical things around deadlines for submission, right? If you get a proposal that comes in 5 or 15 minutes late past the deadline, I think it's important and helpful for an agency to have a conversation about, does that actually mean you don't want to look at that proposal? And should things be ruled out for not complying with those very basic requirements? And I think things around font size and formatting definitely can fall into that category where, if the proposal is legible and its contents imply that the vendor or provider can provide the service you're looking for, that's often, that doesn't need to be disqualifying by any means.
Fantastic. I think that is pretty good on the questions we received. I did see a question about how and where you can find these sessions recorded, and they are published on OPM's website. I will follow up from this training, as I have with trainings in the past, with the materials once they're posted. If you are not receiving my training emails and you would like to, you can send me an email. So that would be really helpful. And that way I can sort of include you on the distribution list. But we will, once we're able to make these available, after making sure that we're responding to everyone's questions and getting all the finalized content uploaded, we will communicate once we have everything set. So just before we wrap, a quick plug, we will have some more training sessions coming up. Again, if you are not on my distribution list about these trainings and you're not receiving my emails and you would like to, please feel free to let me know and I will add you onto that distribution list. I will be communicating about these upcoming trainings via email. Some of the ones that we have planned for the next few months or the rest of this year are a training on best practices for submitting core CT requisitions, which we know is really crucial to some of the work that you all do. So we're hoping to pull in some guests from other departments who also help with the core requisition side to help train on that. We're also going to hold a training on updated procedures for cost effectiveness evaluations. We know there's been a lot of confusion about this in the past, and so we're working to get some new guidelines in place on that. And we are also working on some updates to the OPM procurement standards. So keep your eyes peeled for a training on once those are released on those revisions and how to implement them and act on them. So stay tuned. We will be providing more information about those over email as they are scheduled. It's only 2:22, but I think we can give you a few minutes back, maybe for a break before your next Teams call. But thank you so much for joining us today. We really hope to hear from you about how we can help with specific RFPs or answer more questions. I'm gonna link to the chat in the chat to our survey once more. Really helpful to have you all fill these out so that we know how we're doing and how we can help train you all in the future. So here is that link, and I will let you all go and hope you have a great day. Take care, everyone.